welcome or welcome back. Now, if you didn't see my last video, I made a custom trash cabinet and it almost killed me. So if you haven't seen that yet, maybe go check out the last video. But in this video, I'm going to try to make a country style kitchen sink cabinet using this sink right here. Now, I'm not a professional, I'm not a cabinet maker. I probably don't do things the way professionals do them. But sometimes it doesn't matter how you get to the finish line, as long as you get there. So, with that said, I'm done yapping, and let's just start this build together. So for this country sink, I know that I need a bottom panel that is 35¼ inches wide and 23 inches deep. And I need two panels that are 23 inches deep and 31 inches tall, because my face frame will overall be 36 inches and hopefully look like this in the end. Here I am setting up my dado blade to the proper height and thickness so that my panels come together perfectly and are nice and flush with each other. Now I need to cut a rabbet on one end of both panels that will end up at the bottom and be glued to the bottom panel of the cabinet. Confusing? Well, hold on and you'll see what I mean. Now you can see the rabbet that I cut. I've set up my square clamps, applied my glue, and now that side panel sits nicely on the bottom panel to create what is essentially a half lap joint. With the panel in place and clamped, I then take my 18 gauge brad nailer and shoot some nails in to add some mechanical strength to the joint. I mirror the same process on the other panel by setting up my clamps in place so that I can apply my glue, set the panel, and fasten the panels together with my brad nailer. Now I need to make two supports, one for the top and one for the bottom, because we need the back to stay open for plumbing. It's important to take your measurement from the bottom of the box and not the top, because the bottom is already set in place. So you want to match the top with the bottom to ensure that your box stays square. I'm making my cross supports by doubling up two 1/2 inch pieces of plywood because I want them to be rigid. You can see that I've set up a stop block to make sure that I cut all 4 supports at exactly the same length. But honestly, the better way to do this would be to laminate your plywood together first, let it dry, then cut it to the correct size. But, you know, the reason I say you should laminate them first is because once you start doing your glue up, the 2 pieces of wood will want to slide on each other when you try to squeeze them together. And honestly, it's just an unnecessary issue that could be avoided by, well, not doing it the way that I'm showing you at this current moment. But with a little bit of fussing, I was able to get the supports glued up, and I also used some 3/4 inch pin nails to hold them in place. You can see that I lined everything up the best that I could, and I did what adjusting I could do as I sent more pins through. I started with the bottom support because, well, it's just easier to do than the top one. But it's pretty straightforward. I just applied the glue along the bottom and then up the sides. Quite a bit of glue, honestly, because I want to make sure that it makes good contact, and then I can just wipe off all the excess that squeezes out when I shove the support in there. And once the support is in there and lined up, I take my 18 gauge nailer, shoot a couple nails into both sides of the support, then I just do the same thing along the bottom edge. I did decide to use some clamps and kind of piggyback my way down, and again, just to make sure that I had good contact for the glue, you know, for it to do its thing. If you measured correctly, then the bottom of your box should be perfectly square on both sides, which means once you install the top support, it too should be square. But the recording of that process was unfortunately lost to the GoPro gremlins. With the box made, I can move on to building the toe kick. I build my toe kicks out of 3/4 inch plywood, and I rip them down at 3.5 inch strips. The reason I make my toe kicks separately is because for me, who's never made cabinets, it's just easier to make a box and then make a stand and then put the box on the stand because I make enough mistakes as it is. And you'll see all of my mistakes in this video. So I make my toe kicks 3.5 inches tall and my box 31 inches tall so that in the end, I have a standard counter height of 36 inches. You can see that I used my square clamps to easily square the box so I can use some wood glue and some 18 gauge brad nails to hold the toe kick together. And you could fill in the holes, but I plan on gluing a finished face over the toe kicks after install. I like to check for square by measuring corner to corner both ways, and if it is square, then the measurements will be the same. Now that the toe kick is done, I can take it over to my spacious staging area. And I can make sure that the toe kick is level on the ground. Now I want to make sure that it's level in both directions. That way, when I place the cabinet box on it, it should, in theory, be perfectly level. This sink is an under counter mount, so that means I need the top of this lip to be ever so slightly beneath the top of the cabinet. So I'm going to use this spacer block to mark where the sink needs to sit. I'm using the spacer block, which is just slightly thicker than the lip of the sink, and marking from the top of the cabinet on both sides because I need to make some sort of shelf on both sides for the sink to actually sit on. If you're confused, don't worry, because I was too. But what I need to do is center the sink so I can figure out how far the shelves need to stick in for the lip to catch on. So I'm measuring both sides until the sink is centered. Then I can measure from the side panel to the side of the sink under the lip. You can see here what I mean by under the lip, and you can also see me struggling to measure how far from the back of the cabinet the shelves need to extend because the sink will actually be inset a few inches once installed. Now I was going to laminate some plywood together to create these shelves, but the instructions actually recommended to use a 2x4 cut to size. So I decided to mill this scrap of 2x6 to be flat and square. Then I can get the precise final dimensions that I need, and the sink will sit on a perfect flat surface, and the lip will make contact across the entire shelf to distribute the weight more effectively. Once my material is flat and square, it's easy to rip it into 2 equal pieces. Now this is important so that the sink will easily fall into center. Then I take them over to my miter saw and give them the final cross cuts so that both sides will mirror each other in the cabinet, making the final install of the sink much easier than just guessing. With the shelves made, I want to test fit and make sure that my spacing is correct. So I'm going to use that same spacer block from earlier along with a level to cross-reference to make sure that the shelf is lining up properly. Then I'm going to drill and run some screws in from the outside to temporarily hold the shelf in place. Then I decide to use another piece of scrap that is also flat and square to use as essentially a stop block so that I can remove the shelf and easily glue the shelf in place back in the exact spot that it needs to be in. I wanted some extra support because the shelf sticks out about 3 inches and the sink will act as leverage pushing down on the shelf. So I decided to laminate 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood together to give me a solid and strong base to make my supports. Once the glue is dry enough, I use my small sled to cut out the triangles so I can clamp them in place for the cut. Now you could use a regular miter gauge for this, but the sled is just safer because you can clamp the material to the sled and line up your cut exactly where you want it without it moving or creating a danger of kickback. And trust me, I know all about the dangers of kickbacks. Yeah, I did that. It's in my last video if you want to watch that after this video. I only made 4 triangle supports, so I decided to just glue in a regular block to the back of the cabinet to support the corner because I can easily just glue and staple it from both the back of the cabinet and from the side. I want 1 support in the middle and 1 on the end. Now this might look like overkill, but the instructions actually said it should be able to withstand 200 pounds. I'm not sure who is standing in their sink, but either way, I made it strong. And then I just repeated the exact same steps on the other side. Now, I have no idea about what is the best way to make this face frame, but I do know that I need it to cover both sides of the sink. Then I need a horizontal piece because there will also be 2 doors that open. There will someday be a tray that pulls out. So how am I going to build this? I genuinely have no idea, but how bad can it be? After cutting my hard maple to rough size, running it through my jointer a few times to get one flat side and one square edge, I run it through my planer to make my faces parallel and to get the thickness that I want, which is 5/8 of an inch. Then I can rip it down to final width, which for me is 1 1/4 inch. I assemble my face frames with pocket screws and glue, so after drilling all my holes, I can start assembling the bottom half of my face frame. Now, I don't know if this was the best way to do this, but I decided to make a frame in essentially 2 parts. I'm making the bottom part of the frame first, then once that is done, I can take it over to the cabinet and do a test fit. Then I can figure out what size pieces I need for the upper part of the frame that will sit up against the side of the sink. With the bottom frame done, I can temporarily clamp it onto the cabinet. Then I take my 1/8 inch spacer block and check my spacing across the entire bottom and on both sides. I also check for level. Then I can figure out the 2 upper pieces of the frame. Making sure that the sink is exactly centered where I want it, I can now take the measurements for the 2 upper pieces. Then I make sure that both sides are equal, and it appears that they are. After cutting out the 2 upper pieces, I drilled a few pocket holes and have set up my square clamps in the correct spot so that I can easily just glue and screw the final pieces to the face frame. Now, if you're ever going to make anything with pocket screws, I highly recommend getting a couple of these face clamps. Now, I have the Craig clamps, but any brand will work. Just make sure you get the ones with the large face pads because that's what will keep your material nice and flush to each other as you're screwing in your screws. I also only use the impact on the lowest setting to start the screw, then I always finish them with a hand driver. If you've seen my other video, you know that I love to test fit everything. You may also know that I love admiring when I do nice work. But you may also know that in my last video, I placed the cabinet on its back. Then I placed the frame on top of it and nailed it in that way. But because I have this sink to deal with, I'm worried that doing it that way will result in me misplacing the frame and the entire cabinet would then have to just be burned. So that leaves me with no choice but to install the frame in place as it sits. I start day 3 with sanding the face frame. Now this won't be my final sand, but before I install it, I like to go over the whole frame with 100 grit paper. Then after it's installed and I fill the nail holes from the install, that's when I'll do my final sanding of 180 grit because these cabinets will eventually end up being painted. Installing the frame in the vertical position like this wasn't really all that hard since I have the sink clamped in place and I made the frame to fit pretty tight against the sink with only about a 1/16 inch gap on either side. Getting the frame placed in the right spot isn't the challenging part. The part that was challenging was trying to get the glue on quick enough that it didn't just roll off the edge and getting the frame on before the glue started to set up. I was able to get it installed with little issue, or so I thought. And here's the first mistake of many that I will make in this video. Now at the time I had no idea what I did wrong, but this corner is somehow not square, but the other corner is perfectly square. So what happened? Well, when I go back and review my recording, you can see here that when I was screwing that corner together, I forgot to add the adjacent clamp, but I remembered to add it to the other corner, which is why one corner is square and one is not. This means the top of the frame has the proper overhang, but the bottom of the frame is actually flush with the cabinet. This is definitely not ideal, but there will be a dishwasher against that side of the cabinet, so I'll make something work during the install. Now I can install the drawer slides, and I'm not going to go into much detail because A, I went into pretty deep detail in my last video on how to install these slides, and 2, I make so many mistakes from here on out that it would just cause more confusion than not. But what I'm doing now is I have to make blocks to fill the space between the slide bracket and the back of the cabinet. I'm just using regular wood glue and super glue with activator to permanently attach these blocks together. And in the near future, I will wish that I didn't do this. Now that I have both blocks made, I need to glue one in this corner and one in that corner. Super simple. I just use the combination of wood glue and super glue to set the blocks in place. Then I will put a few staples in from the back side of the cabinet. And don't judge me for my strength. That super glue is really hard to squeeze out. When you're installing the slides, you want to make sure that they're set back about 1/8 of an inch. I just line up the notch on the slide to the back of my frame because you don't want it to be flush like this. If you make it flush, then your drawer box will stick past the frame, which is just going to cause a headache. Now I can screw the slide into the face frame, and I'm only using one screw for now just to hold it. Then I'm going to use my spacer blocks to make sure that the back of the slide is spaced the same amount as the front to account for the face frame, because I want the slides to be perfectly parallel to each other so they don't bind once the drawer is installed. With the slides installed, I can measure for my tray. Now I'm using 21-inch slides, so I know that my overall depth needs to be 21 inches. But the measurement I really need to find out is how wide the tray needs to be. I need to measure from outside edge to outside edge of the slides. But then I need to account for the extra width that's required for the sides of the tray to sit over the slides. You'll see what I mean as I make the tray. I'm still using the 1/2-inch birch ply to make the tray, and I'm just ripping it down to 3-inch strips. Then I need to dado a groove in all 4 sides so that the bottom panel will sit up from the bottom so that the sides will cover the slides and give it the space needed to attach the clips that clip the tray into the actual slides. Wow, that was a mouthful. But the clips need a 1/2-inch clearance, so I've set my fence a 1/2 inch away from the blade, and I've set my blade to cut slightly larger than the thickness of my plywood. Since this is a tray and not a drawer with a drawer face, I had to miter my corners. Otherwise, I would have those ugly plywood ends exposed, and no one wants to see that. I'm just using glue and some small pin nails to hold my corners together because clamping a mitered corner is challenging and I didn't feel like making calls. And because I'm terrible at math in my old age, I put 3 sides together first, then I take my measurement for the bottom panel, then I slide the panel in and finish the last side of the tray. I've cut strips of this beautiful dark walnut to use as trim to cover up the exposed plywood edges, which will add a really nice contrast once all the cabinets are finished and sealed with a natural clear finish. Now I've ripped these trim pieces so that they are just slightly wider than the thickness of the plywood. That way I can come back and sand them flush to the sides once everything is glued and nailed. And again, I'm just using wood glue and my pin nailer. Next, I need to cut 2 small sections out of the back side so that the bottom panel will sit flat on the drawer slides. So I'm marking 1.25 inches from each corner to cut out to give clearance for the drawer slides. I'm going to use my flush cut saw first to cut along the lines that I just made. And I know this isn't the correct saw to use, but it's really the only hand saw that I have, so I'm using it. Then I will use my oscillating saw to cut along the bottom of the panel. I'm using my self-centering drill bit to drill the holes for my clips. And if you've built the box correctly, the clips should push right up against the edge and be in the right spot. And now you can see why I needed that 1/2 inch spacing when I cut my dado groove. This is what allows the tray to clip into the slides and make both the clips and the slides hidden by the tray. At the back of the slides are these little tabs. Now these tabs are what give you the adjustability of the tray. So I need to mark the back of the tray to drill some holes. And the best way to do this is to just set the tray in place and give it a little smack with the mallet on both sides. Now that I have my marks, I'm using a 1/4 inch bit with some tape marking my depth so I don't accidentally drill all the way through the tray. And I drill one hole on both sides, and now the tray is ready for the final install. Do you remember earlier when I said I was going to make many more mistakes throughout this project? Yeah, well, this was my next major mistake. Do you see the major mistake that I made? And yes, the tray is pushed in all the way. And do you notice something off? Well, the tray sticks out about a 1/2 inch past the face frame. I don't want to remake the entire tray, and as bad as I feel in this moment, I do think I have a solution. I ended up removing one of the 1/2 inch blocks of plywood from those back blocks that I made, which pushes the slides back the 1/2 inch that I need. But then, that creates yet another problem. By pushing the slides back a 1/2 inch, that makes the front of the slide that sits on the bottom of the face frame and screw into the side of the face frame, well, not line up with the face frame anymore. So my fix for that is to essentially extend the face frame into the cabinet with these little blocks that I cut to be flush with the frame once I glue them in place. This will give me a place to screw the front of the slides to the cabinet. And because the slides have been pushed back a 1/2 inch, that means the clips that hold the tray to the slides are now sitting a 1/2 inch away from the slides and have no chance of clipping into place. So yet again, I have another issue I need to fix. But this one is quite easy. All I need to do is add more material between the front lip of the tray and the clip. So I just cut out 2 small pieces from 1/2 inch plywood that I can glue in the corners where the clips screw into, which will then push the clips back the 1/2 inch that I need for them to actually clip into the slides. After letting all the newly glued pieces dry overnight, I can now reinstall my slides to my frame extenders. I also reinstalled the clips on the tray, but that recording got corrupted, so you'll just have to take my word for it. This cabinet will have 2 doors, so I need to figure out my measurements, and I think I figured them out so that I should have about an 1/8 of an inch gap between the 2 doors. But with all the mistakes that I've already made, I'm not totally confident in my thought process, if I'm being completely honest. These cabinets that I'm making all have shaker style doors and drawer faces. So after milling up some hardened maple and cutting them to my final dimensions, I always mark my stock with an S and an R for style and rail. I do this so that when I cut the grooves for the door panels, I can track the orientation of my material so that they all get cut the same. And what I mean by that is, when you set up for the groove, you do want it as centered as possible, but you likely won't get it set perfectly in the middle of the stock. So this makes sure that each piece has the groove in the same spot, and then you can keep track of the orientation throughout the entire assembly process. If you want a more detailed explanation on how to make the shaker style faces, watch my last video on how to set everything up, or let me know in the comments if you want a dedicated video on how to make shaker style door and drawer frames. Now we need to cut out my tenons, and I'm cutting 3/4 inch tenons because I cut a 3/4 inch groove in all my stiles and rails. I'm using my 3/4 inch dado stack, and I'm setting my blade height so that I just barely remove the material up to where the groove starts. It's best to set your blade height slightly below where you think it needs to be and slowly creep up on that groove so you don't take too much material off and end up having loose joints. You can see here that I have my miter gauge set up just right to cut my 3/4 inch tenon, but I still have a little bit more material that I need to remove. So I need to raise my blade slightly until it just cuts right up to where my groove starts. Keep making small increments with your blade height until you have it dialed in just right, where you're left with something like this. Once your blade is set, you want to make the first cut of your tenons on one side of all of your pieces first. This is another reason why I mark my pieces with an S and a R, so I can cut all of my pieces with my marking facing up first, because I will need to readjust my blade height again to cut the other side of the tenon. Now that one side of my tenons are all cut, I need to readjust the height of my blade again because I've cut all of my pieces with the marking facing up, and now I need to cut all the pieces facing down. The reason I need to readjust my blade height is because there is no way that I actually got my groove centered perfectly in my material. So if I were to just go ahead and cut the other side with the same blade height, I run a big possibility of cutting too much material, and then my tenon would be way too loose in the joint. So I'm just going to do the same process and slowly creep up on my groove until it removes just enough material. With all of my tenons cut out, I can test fit my frames, and if I do have any joints that are a little bit too tight, I just take my chisel and shave a little off of that tenon until I have the fit that I want. Ideally, you do want your joint to be a little bit tight and have some friction fit, but in the end, it will all get glued together. Once I'm happy with my fitment, I take this time to sand the inside edges before I put my panels in and actually glue everything together. It just makes it much easier than trying to get sandpaper on that little edge with a panel in the way. After cutting out my door panels and test fitting everything once again, I can now do the final assembly of my doors and glue all my joints together. I only put glue on the tenons and I don't actually glue the panels in the grooves. I do this because technically these panels are floating panels, and though MDF is pretty stable, it is still susceptible to some movement with seasonal changes. And I always check for square by measuring from corner to corner in both directions and make any adjustments as needed. If I was a perfect woodworker, my joints would all be perfect and it would naturally be square, but I'm not perfect. Once both doors are made and set to dry overnight, I want to soften the edges by using my router. Now I'm using a 1/16 inch router bit from Whiteside in my Hercules corded router. And yes, I absolutely love this little router. It's very well made, does not feel cheap at all, and has powered through everything that I've put it through. And in my opinion, it is absolutely worth the $100 price tag. And I actually got it for about 80 bucks with a coupon. After I router all of my edges, I come back with some 220 grit paper by hand and just do a light sand on all of the outside edges. Then I also soften the inside edges around the panel by hand as well. Now I can install the door hinges. And these are just your regular soft close hinges, but they can be real tricky to install, unless you have one of these awesome hinge jigs. Now I have the Craig one, but I'm sure there are plenty of other options out there. This is just the one that I have. It comes with the exact Forstner bit that you need, and it just easily clips into the jig. Now I've already marked out for my hinges, making sure that the bottom hinge is out of the way for the tray that I made. Then all you do is just line up the jig to your mark with the notch in the center of the jig, chuck up the bit, clamp the jig down in place so it doesn't move on you while you're drilling, and just drill your holes. It literally cannot get any easier than this. I drill the other hole for the second hinge, then I use my combination square to make sure my hinge is aligned straight, and making sure to use a self-centering drill bit, I drill both holes, screw in the screws, and then just repeat those same steps for each hinge. Now I can install my doors, and I've clamped a straight edge along the bottom to help hold the door at the right height, so I can mark the holes for my hinges. Drill the holes on one side and repeat the same process on the other side. Then I can finally install these doors, do my final sanding, and be completely done with the cabinet. Or so I thought. What in the world happened? I just spent 2 days on these doors and I somehow messed up big time. I have no idea how this got past me, but I never took into account the width of the shaker frames in my overall dimensions. It was at this point, all I wanted to do was go crawl under a rock and give up entirely. I was so frustrated with myself, and just as I was about to give up, I remembered a verse from the Bible. But as for you, be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded. So I spent the next day remaking the doors, and they actually came out nicer than the original doors. My tenons came out much better, which made the joints much tighter and more seamless. The hinges were all in the correct spot. The doors were way more square than before. The tray pulls out perfectly as intended. The slides aren't binding up and they close softly, just as they should. The doors both close perfectly as they should, with the soft close hinges as well. I'm super happy with how it all came out, and so I've got to thank God for the motivation. So overall, I'm very happy with the way this cabinet turned out, even with all the mistakes. I learned a lot about what not to do making cabinets. So I do have more cabinets to make. I have all of the upper cabinets that I still need to make. I need to make one of those corner cabinets. You know, the corner cabinets that go into the corner that are like on a 45-degree angle. Never done that at all. So there's going to be many more mistakes made. So I believe that's going to be the next cabinet that I'm going to make. And I do plan on making a video for that as well. So if you, for whatever reason, like my videos, please subscribe, like the video, and I'll be making a few more, at least for these kitchen cabinet videos. Then I'll also be making a lot of videos on other stuff that I make. Yeah, so if you stuck around and watched the whole video, thank you so much. I do want to let you know real quick, I do have a website. It's called blackcactuswoodwork.com. I'll leave the URL or whatever in the description of this video. I currently have two, so I hand carved these necklaces. I made one for my daughter and one for myself. At least currently at this time of releasing this video, I have two available on the website. They are completely out of premium dark walnut, completely carved by hand with just chisels and some sandpaper, and then genuine leather cord that I tie so that it can be adjustable. So you can give it to a child and make it small, and then they can grow up, and then they can make it bigger, and then yeah. So if you like the necklace, just go check it out, blackcactuswoodwork.com. I also have some board butter there. That's great on any kitchen utensils. It's food safe. I make it by hand here in my shop at home. It's just 2 ingredients, so it's safe. Promise you, it's safe. You can use it on spoons, ladles, your cutting boards. It's what it's mainly used for, is conditioning your cutting board, but you can use it on any wood surface that you would like to recondition. So check that stuff out, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.